Have you ever looked back at someone you once loved and realized something unsettling? Not that they changed, not that you changed, but that maybe you were never really in love with who they actually were. At least, not fully. Because when you think about it clearly, there were moments you ignored things that didn't sit right, things you explained away, things you told yourself don't matter, and yet somehow, you still felt deeply attached. So what was it that you were actually in love with? Was it them? Or was it the version of them you believed they could become? Because there's a quiet truth in relationships that most people don't notice until after it ends. Sometimes, we don't fall in love with reality. We fall in love with potential. And the scariest part is, it doesn't feel fake in the moment. It feels real. It feels intense. It feels like hope. But hope has a way of reshaping what we see. And slowly, without realizing it, we stop seeing the person in front of us and start seeing the future we imagined instead. Potential is one of the most emotionally addictive things in relationships, because potential is not what someone is. It's what they could be, and could be leaves room for imagination, room for hope, room for possibility. And the human brain loves possibility more than certainty. Certainty feels fixed, but possibility feels alive. So when you meet someone and you see even a glimpse of something meaningful, kindness, chemistry, intelligence, vulnerability, your mind starts building a story around it. Not intentionally, it happens automatically. You don't just see the person. You start seeing a future. You start seeing growth. You start seeing change. You start seeing what life could look like with them if things go right. And that imagined future begins to feel just as real as the present. Sometimes even more real. Because the future version of someone is always more emotionally appealing than the incomplete version standing in front of you. In the beginning of a connection, you never have the full picture of a person. You only have fragments, moments, behaviors, words, small signals. And your brain does something very important with incomplete information. It fills in the gaps. If someone is kind sometimes, you imagine they are a kind person. If someone shows affection occasionally, you imagine they are affectionate. If someone shows emotional depth once in a while, you imagine that depth is always there. But what you're actually doing is constructing a full version of someone based on partial data. And the more emotionally invested you become, the more generous that interpretation becomes. Not because you're naive, but because your mind is trying to resolve uncertainty. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and imagination is easier to sit with than confusion. So slowly, you begin to bond with the version of them your mind created, not necessarily the full reality of who they are. At first, hope feels harmless, even positive. It feels like motivation, like belief in someone, like seeing their best self. And in healthy relationships, hope can actually be a good thing. But in unbalanced situations, hope starts doing something different. It begins replacing what you are actually experiencing. You stop responding to what is, and start responding to what might be. So when someone is inconsistent, you don't see inconsistency. You see they're just going through something. When someone is distant, you don't see distance. You see they just need time. When someone doesn't fully show up, you don't see lack of effort. You see they're still figuring things out. And each explanation softens the reality just enough to keep the hope alive. But over time, you're no longer reacting to their behavior. You're reacting to your interpretation of their potential. And that's where emotional attachment begins to deepen in a very specific way. Not through clarity, but through reinterpretation. Reality is stable. Potential is uncertain. Reality gives you what is happening now. Potential gives you something to chase. And chasing activates emotion. It activates imagination. It activates hope. That's why people can feel more emotionally attached to someone who is inconsistent than someone who is steady. Because inconsistency keeps the mind engaged. It creates contrast. And contrast creates meaning. One good moment feels extremely meaningful after several uncertain ones. So instead of detaching, you become more invested. Not because things are getting better, but because your brain is trying to make sense of the pattern. And the easiest way to make sense of it is to believe the good version is the real one, and everything else is temporary. If you really break it down, there are usually three versions of a person in early connection. There is who they are consistently, there is how they show up sometimes, and there is who you believe they could become. An emotional attachment often forms in the space between those three versions, not just in one of them, which means when you say, "I fell in love with them," what you might actually mean is, "I fell in love with a combination of moments, possibility, and imagination that felt real enough to believe in." And that belief is powerful, because once your mind accepts a version of someone, it becomes emotionally costly to question it. So even when reality starts to contradict the image, you don't immediately adjust your perception. Instead, you try to preserve it. You look for exceptions. You focus on good moments. You minimize inconsistency. And slowly, the imagined version becomes emotionally dominant. One of the hardest parts of falling in love with someone's potential is that you're not just letting go of a person. You're letting go of a future, a version of life you already started living in your mind. Because by the time reality becomes clear, you've already invested emotionally into what could have been. You've already imagined conversations that haven't happened yet. You've already pictured growth that hasn't taken place. You've already assigned meaning to moments that were never meant to represent the whole picture. So when things start to fall apart, you don't just feel sadness, you feel resistance. Because accepting reality means losing more than the person. It means letting go of the story you built around them. And that story often feels more painful to lose than the actual relationship. So instead of releasing it, the mind tries to preserve it. It says things like, maybe they'll change. Maybe they just need time. Maybe things will go back to how they were at the beginning. But what's often being protected isn't the relationship. It's the potential. This is why people can stay emotionally attached long after the relationship no longer feels good. Because they're not staying for what is happening. They're staying for what might still happen. And that creates a very specific emotional loop. Good moments become proof. Bad moments become exceptions. Distance becomes temporary. Confusion becomes part of the process. And slowly, your emotional baseline shifts. You stop asking, "Am I happy in this?" and start asking, "Could this become what I want it to be?" That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because now you're not measuring the relationship by its present reality. You're measuring it by its future possibility. And the future is always flexible enough to keep hope alive. At some point, something usually shifts. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it's quiet. You notice less effort, less consistency, less emotional presence. And suddenly, the gap between reality and potential becomes harder to ignore. Because potential requires energy to maintain. It needs justification. It needs interpretation. It needs hope. And when those start to fade, you're left with what's actually in front of you. Not the version you imagined. Not the version you hoped for. Just the reality. And that moment can feel disorienting. Because it creates a conflict between two emotional truths. One part of you remembers what you felt in the beginning. And another part of you is finally seeing what has been happening for a while. And those two things don't match. So your mind tries to reconcile them. It searches for explanations. It tries to bring the good version back into focus. But eventually, if clarity keeps increasing, something shifts. Not immediately, but gradually. You begin to see the difference between what you experienced and what you imagined. There are a few signs that someone isn't just loving a person, but also their potential, not as a judgment, but as awareness. Because most people don't realize it while it's happening. One sign is when you find yourself constantly saying, "They're not usually like this," or "They'll be different once things settle," or "They just need time to figure things out." Another sign is when your emotional connection feels stronger in your mind than in your actual day-to-day experience with them. Meaning, the relationship feels more intense when you think about it than when you actually live it. And another sign is when you're more attached to who they could become than who they consistently are. Because consistency is reality, and inconsistency often feeds imagination. None of this means the connection wasn't real. It just means part of your attachment may have been built around possibility, not just presence. And recognizing that difference is where clarity begins. Real love doesn't mean ignoring potential, and it doesn't mean expecting perfection, but it does mean something very important. It grows in reality, not just in imagination. Real connection is built on what someone consistently shows you, not just what they occasionally show you. It doesn't require you to constantly interpret behavior to feel secure. It doesn't rely on filling gaps with hope. It doesn't depend on future versions of someone to feel valid in the present. Instead, it feels grounded, not because it is perfect, but because it is consistent enough to understand. And that understanding removes a lot of emotional noise. You're not constantly guessing. You're not constantly adjusting your interpretation. You're not constantly hoping the next version of them will finally match the one in your mind. There's less confusion and more clarity. One of the most important emotional shifts people go through is learning to separate possibility from reality, not to become cynical, but to become grounded, because potential isn't meaningless. It can be beautiful, it can be inspiring, it can even be part of love, but it can't replace consistency. It can't replace effort. It can't replace emotional availability, and it can't replace how someone actually shows up over time. So the shift isn't about rejecting hope. It's about balancing it with what is real. Because when you stop over-investing in potential, you start seeing people more clearly, not in a harsher way, but in a more honest way. And honesty creates better decisions, not just in relationships, but in how you understand your own emotional patterns. Maybe the real lesson here isn't that we fall in love with the wrong people, or that we're naive, or that we should stop believing in potential. Maybe the lesson is simpler, that love becomes complicated when imagination starts leading reality, when the version of someone in your mind becomes stronger than the version in front of you, and when hope starts doing the emotional work that consistency should be doing. Because in the end, people don't usually lose relationships because they didn't believe in someone's potential. They lose them because they ignored the difference between potential and reality. And once you start seeing that difference clearly, everything changes. Not just how you see them, but how you choose the next time. Because you stop asking, what could this become? And start asking, what is this showing me right now? And that question changes everything. Because at the end of the day, we don't just fall in love with people. We fall in love with versions of them. Some real, some imagined. And learning to tell the difference between the two might be one of the most important lessons in understanding love itself.